At midnight, history often looks simplest when the lamps are low. We open a rusted door labeled the Dark Ages, and the hinges complain with someone else's prejudice. Beyond it stands 1,000 years of Europe, not silent, not empty, but crowded with voices we were trained to ignore. The familiar story feels comfortable. Rome falls, the lights go out, people forget how to think, and only centuries later does reason finally return. That version is neat, dramatic, and wrong in nearly every useful way. The age was violent, yes. It was also inventive, devout, ambitious, filthy in some places, clean in others, frightened, curious, and stubbornly alive. So tonight, we do not defend a golden fantasy. We walk into the shadow to find out which darkness was real and which darkness was painted there later. The label itself is the first clue. Dark Ages is not a neutral lantern held by the past, but a mirror polished by people who wanted to flatter themselves. Renaissance writers looked back toward Rome and Greece, then cast the centuries between as a valley of cultural gloom. They needed a night before their dawn. Later historians sharpened that contrast, turning a messy transformation into a morality play about decline and rescue. But a name can trap the imagination. Call a room dark often enough, and people stop searching for windows. When we look closer, the windows are everywhere. Monasteries kept libraries breathing, not because monks were modern scientists, but because books mattered to prayer, law, memory, and power. Scribes bent over parchment with aching hands. They copied sacred texts, classical fragments, medical recipes, grammar manuals, astronomy tables, and local records that still whisper through archives. Knowledge did not glide untouched through the centuries. Some works vanished, some survived by accident, some were translated, corrected, misunderstood, and loved enough to be copied again. The story is not a clean line from light to darkness to light. It is more like a candle carried through wind, sometimes flaring, sometimes nearly lost, then handed to another traveler. Contrary to popular belief, medieval people did not generally think the earth was flat. Scholars inherited ancient arguments for a spherical world, and educated writers discussed the shape of the cosmos with calm confidence. The real mystery is why we keep repeating the flat earth myth when the medieval sky itself was more complicated. Imagine a classroom beneath a vaulted roof. The teacher explains spheres, elements, planets, angels, and motion, weaving faith and inherited philosophy into one enormous design. Not every idea was right. But error is not the same as stupidity, and certainty in one century can look strange from another. Another popular picture shows peasants crawling through mud, proud of never washing. It is a deliciously grim image. It is also too easy. They used basins, cloths, baths, rivers, herbs, and public bathhouses where custom, money, and local law allowed. None of that makes a medieval street smell like spring rain. It simply reminds us that disgust is often a lazy substitute for understanding. The past had dirt under its fingernails. It also had etiquette, embarrassment, vanity, perfume, laundry, rules against dumping waste, and plenty of complaints about bad smells. Then comes the myth of total ignorance. We picture farmers staring helplessly at the soil, while monks mutter prayers and kings swing swords in candlelight. Yet the medieval countryside was a laboratory without white coats. People observed seasons, grafted trees, managed mills, rotated fields, improved harnesses, drained marshes, and argued over rights to water. The heavy plow changed northern soils. Watermills and windmills multiplied labor, grinding grain, sawing timber, fulling cloth, and turning rivers into engines of survival. Progress did not always roar. Sometimes it creaked in a wooden gear, turned by a stream beside a village no chronicler bothered to praise. Cities, too, refused to stay frozen. Market squares widened, guilds formed, cathedrals climbed, bridges gathered tolls, and merchants learned the long patience of credit. Medieval commerce was not global capitalism, but cloth, salt, spices, amber, furs, silver, silk, ideas, diseases, and stories moved farther than our caricatures allow. Roads were dangerous in places. So were seas, passes, forests, and courts, yet pilgrims, traders, messengers, students, sailors, and soldiers kept moving anyway. The world was larger than the village. A peasant might never see Constantinople, but coins, rumors, relics, fashions, and fears could travel where bodies did not. Now consider the supposed war between faith and knowledge. The Middle Ages were deeply religious, often intolerant, sometimes brutally so, but religion was not only a locked door. It was also a language for questions. Who made the universe? How should time be measured? What is justice? What may a doctor do? Why do stars move? Monastic schools grew into cathedral schools. Cathedral schools helped feed universities, where students packed rooms, took notes, mocked teachers, borrowed money, and debated with ferocious confidence. They could also be astonishing engines for law, theology, medicine, logic, mathematics, and the habits of disciplined argument. Nobody there was wearing a lab coat. But the hunger to classify, dispute, compare authorities, and test meanings was real. Europe was never the whole stage. While parts of Western Europe struggled after Rome's Western Empire fractured, Byzantium preserved imperial traditions in Greek and Christian forms. Across the Islamic world, scholars translated, challenged, and expanded Greek, Persian, Indian, and their own intellectual inheritances. Baghdad, Cordoba, Cairo, and other centers did not exist as footnotes to Europe. They were bright worlds of astronomy, medicine, mathematics, poetry, philosophy, administration, trade, and urban craft. Medieval Europe received much through contact, conflict, translation, and desire. Knowledge crossed borders with merchants, captives, diplomats, pilgrims, refugees, manuscripts, instruments, and the stubborn curiosity of multilingual scholars. The myth of isolation collapses quickly. The age was braided, not sealed. Another shadow falls across women. We are told they were only silent property, trapped behind doors, waiting for modernity to grant them a voice. Many medieval women endured severe limits. They faced arranged marriages, legal dependency, dangerous childbirth, religious expectations, violence, and exclusion from many formal institutions. But silence was never complete. Women ran households, managed estates, brewed ale, traded goods, joined guild work, healed neighbors, sponsored books, ruled kingdoms, wrote visions, and sued in courts. A convent could be a cage. It could also be a rare space for literacy, authority, music, scholarship, political influence, and a life outside marriage. The truth is not liberation. The truth is texture. Power appeared in unexpected rooms, and oppression did not erase every trace of agency. Popular imagination fills them with endless banquets, secret tunnels, and knights polishing honor in the torchlight. Real castles were machines of control. They stored grain, projected authority, watched roads, sheltered garrisons, frightened rivals, and turned landscape into political argument. War was not constant tournament theater. It was logistics, taxation, disease, hunger, burned harvests, negotiation, ransom, oath-breaking, and the fragile mathematics of loyalty. Knights were not simply noble superheroes. They could be disciplined professionals, predatory landlords, pious patrons, reckless young men, and symbols crafted as carefully as any weapon. The code of chivalry was not everyday reality. It was an ideal that tried to civilize violence, excuse violence, decorate violence, and sometimes restrain it. Vikings suffer the opposite distortion. They arrive in our minds as horned silhouettes, permanently roaring, built only for fire and plunder. Raids were real, terrifying, and often devastating. But Norse societies also farmed, traded, settled, carved, navigated, legislated, composed poetry, and connected distant shores with extraordinary skill. No horned helmet is needed. The longship is impressive enough, a lean instrument of river, ocean, surprise, migration, and memory. Violence marked the period deeply. Yet every age remembers its enemies as monsters, and every age risks confusing terror with the whole truth. Another myth says medieval law was only chaos. There were ordeals, harsh penalties, private revenge, and justice that often bent toward rank and wealth. But there were also charters, courts, customs, juries in formation, records, fines, appeals, and local procedures people understood well enough to exploit. Law was not always fair. It was still a world of rules, claims, witnesses, obligations, and paperwork. Even the famous image of constant torture needs care. Yet the idea of a continent forever dominated by dungeon devices often says more about later imaginations than daily legal practice. Medieval people feared death closely. Infant mortality, famine, war, infection, and plague made life precarious in ways modern comfort can scarcely feel. Still, danger does not mean despair. The Black Death later tore through Europe with unimaginable force. Communities searched for causes, blamed the innocent, prayed, fled, quarantined, traded rumors, and sometimes adapted with grim speed. That catastrophe was not proof that medieval minds were empty. It was proof that humans under terror reach for explanation and sometimes seize the wrong one. Gold leaf caught candlelight in manuscripts, while stone saints leaned from portals, and painted glass turned ordinary sun into theology. Medieval art was not failed realism. It followed different priorities, arranging scale, gesture, symbol, color, and sacred attention into images meant to be read with the soul. Music rose in plain chant, then in layered voices. Time itself became something counted, divided, wrung from towers, and woven into the rhythm of prayer and work. Even monsters mattered. The more we study, the less the word dark explains. It hides regional differences, collapses centuries together, and treats absence in our evidence as absence in their lives. Some places truly suffered severe disruption. Roman roads decayed, cities shrank, literacy narrowed, and political authority fractured across parts of Western Europe. That darkness deserves honesty. But decline in one region can coexist with resilience elsewhere, and loss in one institution can make room for a different form. The past does not owe us a simple mood. It offers contradiction. One village starves while another market grows. One monastery preserves a text while another library burns. One lord funds a chapel while another terrorizes tenants. One scholar calculates the heavens while a mob hunts a scapegoat. This is the real medieval world. Not a sewer of ignorance. Not a candlelit paradise. A human century, century after century, crowded with fear, devotion, hunger, craft, cruelty, tenderness, and restless invention. Why does the old myth survive? Because darkness is useful. It lets modern people feel superior without doing the harder work of comparison. It turns history into a ladder, with us conveniently standing near the top. The Middle Ages were not waiting for us to rescue them with our approval. When the door closes behind us, the darkness has changed. It is no longer the darkness of people who could not think. It is the darkness of distance, missing records, broken stones, burned pages, and our own impatience. So, look again. The age was never simply dark. It was shadowed, glittering, wounded, brilliant, and far too alive to fit inside the myth we inherited.